There are cases that the producers of Judge Judy's courtroom show knew would be interesting before they ever began, and then there are cases that nobody, not the producers, not the audience, not even the legal team standing inside that room, saw coming. This was one of those cases. The paperwork that landed on Judge Judy Scheindlin's desk that morning was, on the surface, unremarkable. A stack of citations, municipal code violations, unpaid fines totaling $10,140. The kind of case a city clerk's office processes by the hundreds every single month. Loitering, camping on public property, trespassing, obstructing a sidewalk. The list went on, fine by fine, date by date, stretching back nearly 2 years across the margins of one young person's life. The defendant's name was Marcus Cole. He was 17 years old, and he had no address, not a bad address, not an old address, not a P.O. box or a friend's couch. The line where an address should have appeared on every single one of those 73 citations was either left blank, filled in with the phrase, "no fixed residence," or, in a few notable cases, a city officer had written the name of a public park where Marcus had been sleeping when he was found. That detail, "no fixed residence," repeated 73 times, was what caught Judge Judy's attention before the case even began. She had seen thousands of cases in her career. She had sat on the bench of New York family court for over 2 decades before she ever walked onto a television set. She had heard every variety of excuse, manipulation, and genuine heartbreak that the legal system could funnel through a courtroom door. She was not a woman given easily to sentiment, and she was not a woman who let the appearance of a situation override what the facts actually said. But facts were exactly what troubled her that morning, because the fact was this: if a person has no address, they cannot receive a notice to appear in court. If they cannot receive a notice, they cannot respond to a citation. If they cannot respond, the fine compounds with late fees. The late fees stack. The citations accumulate. And before long, a 17-year-old boy who owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a backpack he kept under a bridge owed the city of Los Angeles over $10,000. The city wanted that money. Judge Judy had some questions first. The morning the case was called, Marcus Cole arrived before the city's attorney did. He came through the courtroom door wearing a gray hoodie that had been washed so many times, its original color was a matter of guesswork, a pair of jeans with a tear at the left knee, and shoes that had once been white athletic sneakers but were now a specific shade of gray-brown that comes from walking long distances on wet pavement. He was tall for 17, nearly 6 feet. But he carried himself with the compressed, careful posture of someone who had learned, over time, to take up as little space as possible. His hands stayed in his front pockets. His eyes moved around the room with the quiet, assessing alertness of a person who is always calculating the nearest exit. He was not afraid exactly, he was watchful. There is a difference, and anyone who has spent time with young people who have lived on the streets understands that distinction immediately. The production assistant who had reached Marcus through a social services outreach worker said that when she first explained the show to him, his response had been a single question: "Does it cost anything to be on it?" When she told him no, that in fact the show covered legal fees and travel, he had asked if he could keep his backpack with him. She said yes. He showed up with it over one shoulder, a battered green military surplus bag with a broken zipper that he had safety pinned shut. He set it under the defendant's table before he sat down. Then he folded his hands on the table surface and waited. The city's representative was a paralegal named David Harmon, who worked for the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. He arrived 3 minutes after Marcus, carrying a briefcase and a printed copy of the citation record. He was professional, efficient, and clearly accustomed to cases exactly like this one, cases where the municipality needed to establish a legal debt, have it acknowledged on the record, and move toward whatever enforcement mechanism was available. He had handled dozens of similar matters. They were, in his professional estimation, straightforward. He glanced at Marcus once when he sat down. Marcus looked back at him with the same steady, neutral expression he had been wearing since he walked in. Neither of them said a word. Judge Judy entered the courtroom the way she always entered, purposefully, without ceremony, already focused. She did not perform authority, she simply carried it. She took her seat, accepted the case file from her clerk, and opened it without looking up at either party. For nearly 30 seconds she read. The courtroom was quiet enough that the ventilation system overhead was audible. Marcus watched the judge. David Harmon arranged his papers. Then Judge Judy looked up. She looked first at Marcus. She studied him for a moment, not with theatrical intent, but with the practiced clinical attention of someone cataloging information. The shoes, the hoodie, the backpack under the table, the hands folded on top of the surface, steady, not fidgeting. "How old are you?" she asked. 17, Marcus said. "When did you turn 17? March the 9th. She glanced back at the file. "These citations start in April of last year. You were 16 when the first one was issued." "Yes, ma'am." She set the file down. "Where do you live, Marcus?" The question was direct, conversational almost, but it landed in the courtroom with the weight of something that had been coming for a long time. Marcus did not hesitate. "I don't have a place right now," he said. "I stay near Griffith Park mostly. Sometimes the overpass on Fletcher Drive if it's raining." Nobody in the room spoke. Judge Judy kept her eyes on him. "How long?" "About 2 years." 2 years. She repeated it plainly, without inflation, without editorial, just the number, hanging there in the air by itself. "Yes, ma'am." "Where were you before that?" He took a small breath. "Foster care. I aged out of the system at 15. There was a program that was supposed to transition me into housing, but the funding got cut. I was in a transitional facility for about 4 months, and then it closed. After that, I was on my own." Judge Judy turned to David Harmon. "Counsel." Harmon straightened. "Your Honor, this boy was 15 years old when he became homeless. Is that consistent with what your office understands about this case?" Harmon consulted his papers briefly. "We have documentation indicating the defendant's status as experiencing homelessness, yes. The citations were issued across various city jurisdictions and reflect violations of municipal code as encountered by officers in the field." Judge Judy looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very thorough answer to a question I did not ask." She paused. "I asked if your office knew he was 15 when he became homeless. Did you know that when you filed this action?" A beat passed. "The filing reflects the outstanding fines as accumulated. The defendant's background circumstances were not part of the filing criteria." "I see." She turned back to the file. 73 citations over 22 months. Average fine of approximately $138 each. Late penalties assessed on 61 of the 73, and not one of these citations has a valid service address. She picked up one of the photocopied citations and held it up, reading from it aloud. "No fixed residence. Subject advised of violation. Citation issued." Then it goes on to list a fine amount and a due date. She set it back down. "A due date, for a person with no address. For a person who, at the time this particular one was issued, was 16 years old and sleeping outside." The room stayed quiet. Marcus watched her with the same careful steadiness he had maintained since he sat down. There was something in the way he listened, not passive, but deeply attentive, like someone who had learned to extract maximum information from whatever environment they were in, because information was one of the few resources consistently available to him. Judge Judy set the citation down and folded her hands. "Marcus," she said, "tell me about the first ticket." He thought about it for a moment, not because he didn't remember, his memory of it was precise, but because he was choosing how to explain it clearly. "I was sleeping in MacArthur Park," he said. "It was April. I had a sleeping bag and I was on one of the benches near the lake. An officer woke me up around 4 in the morning. He told me I was in violation of a municipal code about camping in public parks overnight. He wrote me a ticket for $120 and told me I had 30 days to pay it or appear in court." "Did he explain what would happen if you didn't pay or appear?" "He said there would be additional penalties." "Did you have $120? "No." "Did you have any money at all?" "I had about $14. I had found some day labor work the week before at a moving company, but they only paid me for 2 days instead of 3. Judge Judy nodded, her expression unchanged. "So you couldn't pay. Did you try to appear in court?" "I tried to find out where I was supposed to go. The ticket had a phone number. I called it from a library phone, but it kept going to a recorded message. I went to the courthouse building it listed on the ticket and waited in the wrong line for 2 hours before someone told me I was at the wrong window. By the time I found the right one, They were closed for the day. I couldn't get back the next day because I had work. What kind of work? I was helping a restaurant owner carry produce deliveries. It was cash, informal. I couldn't miss it because I needed to eat. She absorbed this without expression. And after that first ticket, I got 2 more the next month. Different parks, different officers. I started carrying the first ticket with me because I thought maybe if I showed it and explained, they'd see I was already dealing with a situation, but it didn't help. By the time I had 4 tickets, the first one had already doubled with late fees, and I didn't even know that had happened until I checked it months later at the library. And nobody explained this to you? When the citations were being issued? Some of the officers were okay about it. One of them actually told me. He said, "Look, I have to write this, but if I were you, I'd try to get to the clerk's office and explain your situation. Maybe they can defer it." But the clerk's office kept telling me I needed proof of income or a permanent address to apply for a hardship waiver. I didn't have either. Judge Judy was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not empty, but occupied, thinking, calculating, weighing. "So, in order to get relief from fines you couldn't pay," she said slowly, "you were required to provide documentation that a person in your circumstances would be unable to provide." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to David Harmon. "Counsel," she said, "I want to understand the city's theory of this case. Walk me through it." Harmon cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the city's position is straightforward. Municipal code violations were documented by officers in the field. The fines were assessed per the applicable codes. The defendant was notified, by virtue of each citation issued, of the amount owed and the due dates. The outstanding balance has now reached a level that triggers this proceeding for collection." "He was notified," Judge Judy repeated. "Each citation constitutes notice, yes. Each citation was issued to a person with no permanent address. Each citation was given to a minor. At what point in this process was there a mechanism to ensure he actually received meaningful notice of what was happening to his outstanding balance? The citation itself, she said, cutting across him without raising her voice at all, is a piece of paper handed to a 16-year-old sleeping in a park. It says pay by this date or appear by this date. It does not explain that if you don't pay, the fine doubles. It does not explain that by the time you've missed 7 dates that required a phone number that went to a recording and a courthouse window that had a 2-hour line, you now owe more than some people earn in 3 months of full-time work." She paused. "Is that a fair summary of what these citations actually told him?" Harmon said nothing for a moment. "The process is consistent with how all citations are administered." "I'm aware of how they're administered," Judge Judy said. "What I'm asking is whether the process accounts for the particular circumstances of a 16-year-old minor with no guardian, no address, and no financial resources." "The process is uniform," Harmon said. "Yes," she replied. "It is." She said it in a way that made clear the uniformity was precisely her problem with it. She turned back to Marcus. "Tell me about your family," she said, "if you want to. You don't have to go into things you'd rather keep private." Marcus looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not breaking exactly, but settling. The way a person's face changes when they realize they are being spoken to instead of being processed. "My mom passed away when I was 11, he said. "She had heart disease. After that I went into foster care. I had 3 placements in 4 years. The last one was a good family, but they moved to Oregon, and the caseworker said there wasn't funding to transfer my case, so I went into the transitional program instead." "You were 15 at that point." "Just turned 15, yes. The program was supposed to last until I was 18 and would give me housing, job training, a case manager. I was there for 4 months. Then the city cut the funding and the program shut down. They gave us 2 weeks' notice." He paused. "There were 14 of us in that program, all under 18. They gave us a list of shelters and a bus pass." Judge Judy said nothing for a long moment. Marcus continued. 8 of the 14 shelters on the list were full. 2 of them didn't take minors without a guardian present. One of them, I went and they told me they could take me for 1 night, but after that, I'd have to reapply each day, and they couldn't guarantee a spot. He looked down at his hands briefly, then back up. "I stayed there 2 nights. Then I figured out that the parks near Griffith were safer than a lot of places in the city for someone my age, and I've been there since. Have you been to school? Judge Judy asked. I was enrolled at a continuation school for about 8 months. I had to stop because I couldn't maintain consistent attendance without an address. They required a local address to stay enrolled. I've been doing some online coursework through the library since then. What kind? Mostly math and coding. There are free resources. He said it without self-consciousness, as a plain fact. I'm good at math. What do you want to do, eventually, if things were different? He considered the question seriously. I think I want to work in infrastructure, he said. City planning, water systems, power grids, things that a lot of people take for granted, but that are actually very complicated to maintain and improve. He paused. I think about systems a lot, how they work and why they break down. The room was very quiet. Judge Judy looked at him for a moment longer than she had looked at anyone in the case. Then she turned to David Harmon. Mr. Harmon, she said, you represent the city. I do. The city issued these citations to a minor in the foster care system who had been released from a transitional housing program that the city itself defunded. Subsequently, the city issued 73 citations to that same minor over 22 months for violations that occurred because he had nowhere legally sanctioned to exist within the city's boundaries, and the city is now seeking to collect $10,000 from him. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Help me understand what the city believes justice looks like in this case. Harmon was quiet for a moment. The city's position is that the fines were lawfully assessed and the balance is due. Lawfully assessed, she said. Yes. Let me tell you what I see when I look at this case, Judge Judy said. Her voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but something in its quality shifted, sharper, more precise, like a light narrowing to a point. I see a boy who was placed in the foster care system through no fault of his own, who was transferred to a transitional housing program funded by the city, whose housing was eliminated when the city chose to cut that funding, who was subsequently rendered homeless, and began accumulating municipal violations for activities that are only violations because he had no home, sleeping, existing in public space, not having somewhere else to go, and who is now in a courtroom because the city wants to recover money from him. She paused. The city created the conditions that led to these violations, and now the city is here to be paid for them. Harmon started to speak. She continued. Furthermore, and this is the part that I want on the record clearly, 61 of these 73 citations were issued to a minor, a child. Under California law, a minor does not have the legal capacity to enter into a contract. A fine is, at its core, a financial obligation. There is a serious and unresolved question about whether citations issued to a minor without a guardian or legal representative can generate an enforceable debt in the first place. She turned to the camera briefly, then back. I want that in the transcript. The court reporter, who had been typing steadily throughout, nodded once. Now, Judge Judy said, I'm going to ask the city a question, and I want a real answer, not a procedural one. She looked at Harmon directly. If this court were to dismiss these citations today, if Marcus Cole walked out of here without this debt, what does the city lose? Harmon blinked. $10,140. Has the city budgeted for collection on this debt? Collection proceedings are standard practice? Has the city already written off the likelihood of collecting on this specific debt? A pause. I'm not in a position to speak to the internal accounting, because you know as well as I do, Judge Judy said, that collecting $10,000 from a 17-year-old with no income, no property, no bank account, and no fixed address is not something the city's collections process is designed to accomplish. You cannot garnish wages he doesn't have. You cannot lien property he doesn't own. The only thing that happens when this case ends today, if the debt is affirmed, is that this young man carries a legal judgment against him for the foreseeable future, which will affect his ability to rent an apartment, get a job with a background check, open a bank account, or access credit. She let the list land. In other words, the things he would need in order to not be homeless. The courtroom was very still. Marcus watched her with an expression that was difficult to read, something between disbelief and a very careful kind of hope. the kind that has been disappointed often enough to guard itself. Judge Judy looked down at the case file. She turned a few pages. She was not performing deliberation, she was actually deliberating. Then she set the file down and looked at both parties. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "I'm going to give the city the opportunity to voluntarily withdraw this action." Harmon straightened. "Your Honor, my office doesn't have the authority to." "I understand your office has procedures. I'm asking you to get on the phone at the next available break and call whoever does have that authority, because I want to tell you what I'm prepared to do if this case does not go away today." She folded her hands on the bench. "I'm prepared to enter a judgment in this case, against the city." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives. Harmon stared at her. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me. I am prepared to find that the city of Los Angeles negligently failed in its duty of care to a minor in the foster care system, that the subsequent issuance of citations to that minor for conditions directly resulting from that negligence constitutes a fundamentally unjust application of municipal code, and that the enforcement of those citations is void as against public policy." She said it evenly, as though she were reading a lunch order. "I am also prepared to note for the record that a system which defunds housing programs for minors and then tickets those same minors for being homeless is engaging in something that any reasonable person examining it would describe as a cycle of institutional harm." She let that settle. "I would rather not make that finding today," she continued, "because what this young man needs is not a legal win over the city. What he needs is for this to be over so he can move forward. A judgment, even a favorable one, creates a paper trail that can complicate things in ways that don't serve him." She looked at Marcus. "Do you understand what I'm explaining?" Marcus nodded slowly. "You're saying even if you rule in my favor, it could still cause problems for me later." "It could. Depends on how it's handled. I'd rather the city simply withdraw the action, the record stays clean, and you start from zero. Can you agree to that?" He looked at her. "I'd agree to whatever you think is right." She almost smiled. It was a very small movement at the corner of her mouth, there and gone. "That's the first time in a long time someone has said that to me in this courtroom." She turned back to Harmon. "I'm going to take a 15-minute recess. I suggest you use it." The 15 minutes stretched to 22. Marcus sat at the defendant's table and did not move very much. One of the production assistants brought him a bottle of water, which he accepted and set on the table in front of him without opening it. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the walls of the courtroom, the wood paneling, the light fixtures, the official seals. It was, he would later say in an interview, the first time he had ever sat in a room and felt like something might actually change. He had been told by so many people, in so many contexts, that his situation was unfortunate, but that there was a process, and the process had to be followed, and that following the process would in time produce a result. He had followed the process. He had called the phone numbers. He had stood in the lines. He had explained his situation to intake workers and caseworkers and officers and shelter administrators. And the result, every time, had been a variation of the same answer. There was nothing available right now. There was a form to fill out. There was a list to be added to. There was a waiting period. There was a requirement he couldn't meet. He had stopped expecting rooms to change things. So he sat and looked at the water bottle and waited, because waiting was the one thing he had learned to do with absolute precision. When Judge Judy returned, she took her seat and looked at Harmon. "Well," she said. Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The city is prepared to voluntarily withdraw the action." The production audience, which had been kept unusually quiet throughout the proceeding, released a sound that was not quite applause and not quite a collective exhale, somewhere between the two. Marcus looked down at the table. His hands, which had been folded and steady for the entire hearing, opened slowly, palms flat on the surface, as if he were steadying himself against something. Judge Judy nodded. "Good. That's the right call." She looked at Harmon with an expression that was not unkind, but left no room for misunderstanding. "I want to make something clear to you, and I'd like you to pass it along to whoever made that decision. The fact that this case exists at all represents a failure, not a legal failure, a human one. The system has a gap in it, and this young man has been living inside that gap for 2 years. Closing this case today closes one piece of paper. It does not close the gap." Harmon nodded once. "Understood." She looked at Marcus. Marcus, she said. He looked up. The case is dismissed. You don't owe the city anything. That debt is gone. She said it plainly, no ceremony, no dramatic pause. Just the fact, delivered directly. You understand? He nodded. His jaw was tight. He was working very hard to keep his expression neutral, and he was mostly succeeding, except that his eyes had taken on a brightness that was not there before. There is something else, Judge Judy said. She reached beside her and picked up a single sheet of paper, not a legal document, not a case file, and set it on the edge of the bench. I made some calls during the recess as well. The room shifted. There is an organization in this city called Second Step Housing. They work specifically with young adults who have aged out of the foster care system. They have a program, a proper one, fully funded, not subject to the kind of budget cuts that ended your previous housing placement, that provides stable housing, case management, job training, and academic support for young people between 16 and 24. She paused. I spoke with their director of placement. There is a spot available. It's yours if you want it. Marcus stared at her. She continued. It is not charity. The program requires participation. You work, you attend whatever educational programming they have available, you engage with their support staff. It is structured because structure, for most people trying to rebuild from a position like yours, is not a limitation. It is a foundation. She looked at him steadily. But it is your choice. I'm not ordering you to do anything. You're the defendant, not the court's ward. I'm telling you a door is open if you want to walk through it. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Why? He asked. It was one word, but it carried everything. All the times a room had not changed, all the processes that had not worked, all the lists he had been added to, and the forms that had led nowhere. Why this time? Why you? Why me? Judge Judy looked at him for a long moment. Because, she said, you came in here today, alone, at 17 years old, to face a $10,000 debt that you knew you couldn't pay, and you sat at that table with your hands folded, and you told the truth. Every single answer. You didn't perform, you didn't make excuses, you explained your situation clearly and accurately, and everything you said checked out in the record. She paused. That is not a small thing. Most adults cannot do what you did today, and you did it at 17, in a courtroom, in shoes that have seen better days, with your whole life in a backpack under the table. She picked up her gavel. The action is dismissed. Good luck, Marcus. She brought the gavel down, and the room broke open. The production team that had sat through dozens of cases later said that the response from the crew and the audience that day was unlike anything they had experienced in the show's run. Nobody was cheering exactly. The moment felt too real, too unfinished, too much like something that had been extracted from actual life for the usual courtroom television responses to apply. People were crying, a few of them. The production assistant who had first contacted Marcus through the social services outreach worker had to step out of the room. Marcus sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then he reached under the table, picked up his backpack, and stood. Judge Judy was already preparing to leave the bench. She paused, looked at him one more time. One more thing, she said. You mentioned you're good at math. Yes, ma'am. Then don't waste it. She left the bench. Marcus stood there for another moment, backpack over his shoulder, looking at the space where she had been sitting. Then he turned and walked toward the doors. Between the first citation and the day he walked into that courtroom, Marcus Cole had learned to read cities the way other people read maps. He knew which park bathrooms stayed unlocked past midnight. He knew which library branches would let a person with no card sit inside for hours without being asked to leave, and which ones had a 3-hour limit that was enforced, and which ones only had a sign on the wall that nobody ever followed up on. He knew which fast food restaurants refilled water cups without questioning it, and which ones had managers who came out from the back office when someone sat too long without ordering. He knew which soup kitchens had a mandatory prayer service before the food, and which ones did not, and he had no objection to either, because hunger is a more direct argument than theology. He had, in other words, become an expert in navigating a city that was not designed to accommodate him. This is what homelessness actually looks like for a significant portion of the people who experience it. not the dramatic, visible version that appears at intersections or under bridges in the public imagination, but the constant, exhausting, low-grade management of systems that are not built for you. It is an administrative problem as much as it is a physical one. Every day presents a series of questions. Where do I sleep? Where do I eat? Where do I clean up before a job interview? Where do I store my things while I look for work? Where do I charge my phone? And is a charged phone, with its access to job boards and appointment reminders and maps, a luxury or a survival tool? The answer is both, which is exactly the problem. Marcus had answered all of these questions every day for 2 years, without a case manager, without a support network, without a family to call. He had done it while also attending school for 8 months, while also working informal labor wherever he could find it, while also checking the city's online citation database periodically at the library to watch the number above his name grow. $10,140. He had looked at that number so many times that it had stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a definition, like something the city had decided he was worth, but in reverse. Judge Judy had seen the number too, and she had seen it differently. She had looked at it the way she looked at every number that came before her, as the end result of a process, and a process has steps, and steps have decisions, and decisions have people behind them, and people behind decisions can be asked to explain themselves. She had been asking people to explain themselves in courtrooms for over 40 years. She had developed, over those 4 decades, a very precise sense for the difference between an explanation that was true and an explanation that was correct. David Harmon's explanations were correct. They were accurate representations of the city's procedures. They did not, at any point, intersect with anything that Judge Judy Scheindlin would recognize as an honest engagement with what had actually happened. She had heard that kind of answer before, many times, from people with better lawyers and higher stakes than a city paralegal managing a municipal collection case. It did not impress her then. It did not impress her now. What impressed her was the boy across the table who had shown up alone, told the truth, and answered every question she asked with the kind of clear, structured recall that came from someone who had learned to pay very close attention to the details of his own life because the details of his own life were all he had to work with. I think about systems a lot, he had said, how they work and why they break down. She had thought about that sentence for the rest of the morning. The legal question was real, and she had not been bluffing when she raised it. California law is explicit about the contractual capacity of minors. A minor, defined as any person under 18, generally cannot be bound by a contract without the involvement of a parent or guardian. The question of whether a municipal fine constitutes a contractual obligation or a statutory one is not entirely settled law, and reasonable legal minds have argued both positions. But what Judge Judy understood, from her decades on the bench, was that the spirit of the law's protection of minors is clear even when its letter is arguable. Children are afforded special protection from binding financial obligations precisely because they lack the legal standing, financial resources, and cognitive and social development to navigate those obligations as adults can. Issuing 61 citations to a 16-year-old with no guardian, no legal representative, and no capacity to meaningfully respond to the process those citations set in motion, and then allowing those citations to accrue penalties, compound with interest, and ultimately generate a $10,000 debt that would follow him into adulthood, was, in her view, not just an administrative oversight. It was a systematic failure to apply the law's protections to the population those protections were designed to serve. She had made that point in her ruling. She intended to make sure it was heard. In the weeks following the taping, Marcus Cole enrolled in the Second Step housing program. He was assigned a case manager named Patricia Huang, who later described him as one of the most self-sufficient and focused young people she had worked with, which is both a testament to who he is and an indictment of how long he was left on his own. He completed his GED within 4 months of enrollment. The online coursework he had been doing through the library had kept him closer to a diploma than he had realized. He began a job training program in IT infrastructure. He moved from transitional housing into a shared apartment with 2 other program participants inside 6 months. He did not speak publicly about the Judge Judy case for nearly a year. When he did, in a brief interview with a non-profit publication focused on foster care reform, he said something that people who read it did not easily forget. "I went in there expecting to be told what I owed," he said. That's all I'd been told for 2 years, what I owed, what I didn't have, what I needed to produce to get access to something. I didn't expect someone to look at the situation and ask who the situation was actually fair to. I didn't know that was something that could happen. He was asked what he thought of Judge Judy. He thought about it for a moment. She talked to me like I was a person, he said. Not a case, not a file, not a problem to be resolved. She asked me what I wanted to do with my life, and she actually listened to the answer, and then she did something about it. He paused. I've been in a lot of rooms. That doesn't happen in a lot of rooms. There is a version of this story that the city of Los Angeles would probably prefer not to have documented in detail. In the months after the case, 2 city council members separately cited the Marcus Cole hearing, which had been widely shared online after the episode aired, in proposals to reform how the city handled citation enforcement for minors and for individuals experiencing homelessness. Neither proposal passed in its original form. One of them was still in committee review more than a year later. The transitional housing program that had been defunded, the one Marcus had been part of before it closed, was the subject of a report by the city's audit committee that found the funding cut had displaced a total of 61 minors over a period of 3 years. Of those 61, the report was able to track 44. 17 of them had accumulated municipal citations during their period of homelessness. Combined, those 17 individuals owed the city over $90,000. The report recommended a review of citation practices. The review was ongoing as of the last available update. There are many things a courtroom can be. It can be a machine, processing cases and producing outcomes at scale. It can be a theater, where the performance of justice stands in for the practice of it. It can be a ledger, balancing what is owed against what can be extracted. Judge Judy Scheindlin had sat in enough of them to know all 3 versions by sight, what she understood, and what that case demonstrated, in a way that the thousands of other cases before and after it perhaps did not, was that a courtroom, at its best, can also be the place where someone's story is heard completely for the first time, where the facts are laid out in sequence and the sequence tells a truth that the pieces of it, delivered one at a time in a line at a clerk's window or a bed at a full shelter, could never have told on their own. Marcus Cole's story, told in full, in order, in a room where someone was listening and had the authority to do something about it, was different from Marcus Cole's story told in the margins of a citation form. It was not a more dramatic story. It was not, in the end, even a surprising one. Any person who spent 5 minutes looking at the circumstances would have arrived at the same conclusions Judge Judy arrived at. The problem was that in 2 years, not one person or institution had taken 5 minutes to look at all of it at once. That is what she did. That is what the unexpected move actually was. Not a dramatic gesture, not a theatrical declaration, just attention, applied fully and without distraction to a situation that had been hiding in plain sight. And a boy who had learned to carry everything he needed in a backpack walked out of a courtroom without the weight of $10,000 that was never, by any reasonable measure, his to carry. He walked out into a city that was still, in most of the ways that mattered, the same city it had been when he walked in, but he was not the same. That is how it sometimes works. You cannot always change the system in an afternoon. But sometimes, in a single room, with the right person paying the right kind of attention, you can change what happens next for one specific person. And that, Judge Judy Scheindlin would probably tell you, is the job. That has always been the job. Sometimes justice does not look like what you expect. It does not always arrive with a verdict or a declaration or a number on a check. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a woman who has seen thousands of cases asking the right question at the right time, not, what does this person owe, but what does this situation actually say? And sometimes it arrives in the form of a 17-year-old boy who walks through a door alone, tells the truth when he does not have to, and sits with his hands folded on a table while the world decides what to do with him. Both of those people showed up on the same day, in the same room. That is not a coincidence. That is what courts, at their best, are for.